Okay, lovely sixth formers, today we have Carol Ann Duffy Stuffed. We're going to do this as quickly as possible and with the least amount of personal trauma possible. So you'll find Carol Ann Duffy Stuff on page 38. If you have not already turned to it, that's where you need to be. I'm not going to read through the poem, you can read. What we're going to do is going to start at the top instead. So stuffed, we have this double meaning going on. Obviously there's a sexual element to that, but it's also to do with taxidermy, which is the stuffing of dead animal carcasses to make them look like they are alive often. It's kind of like a really creepy version of Build-A-Bear. Now, if you look, it starts off consistently, the I of the poem is speaking. So there's this speaker or this persona in the poem, and we come to realise that this persona of the poem is perhaps a little bit odd. They are always the subject of their sentences though. They are always the one who is doing the action. And if you look, these sentences all start with I. Showing how this person is the one who is in control, and we have this theme of control running throughout. You can see, for example, the full stop at the end of every line, again showing that idea of control, this idea that the poem is very tightly controlled, and this idea that this person has a very specific way of approaching the situation. The imagery throughout is sinister and violent, so you have the yellow eyes of an owl, the grin of a crocodile, the slither of an eel. In many of these, they're the essence of the animal, but they're the sinister and violent essence of the animal. So the red rag to a bull is the thing that would make the bull violent, or the grin of the crocodile gives this idea of its teeth. The poem for each stanza has these single word statements, and they're all followed by a full stop. Again, these are very controlled in the structure, but again, they show how dispassionate the speaker of the poem is. There's an element of psychopathy in the way that they approach this. They're not about keeping things kind of fun and lively. Instead, it's very controlled. The verb choices are very violent and sexual throughout, so just a few to pull out for you. You've got jerk, spread, screw, and pierce. Again, adding to this violent sexual imagery that runs throughout the poem. And you have this animalistic imagery running through. So words like wild, fierce, tame, they're all kind of animalistic, which in terms of taxidermy makes sense because that's usually done with animals. But if you look here, they're used also to describe a person. So that makes it seem as though that person is being described as animalistic. Perhaps suggests a loss of control on their part. Again, you have this idea of being tame or mute, which suggests that someone's being controlled or is being made voiceless. And that's highlighted as well in the possessive my and my, which is repeated. That idea of taxidermy is brought up again in this idea of a doll, being like a living doll, being a stuffed figure. It's a very literal version of objectification. So whereas you might normally talk about somebody being objectified in a metaphorical sense, being treated like an object rather than like a person, here, this would literally suggest the creation of an object in place of that person. Or you could just read it as metaphorical objectification. And afterwards I like her not to tell suggests an unpleasant, perhaps sexual violence. It's unclear whether it's sexual violence towards a person who is being objectified or whether it's sexual involvement with a taxidermied partner who would therefore already be dead. Either way, it's very odd. So throughout the poem, you have this structure, the single slant rhyme going throughout, and it's this repetition of this L sound, l, 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 which is like this liquid kind of sound all the way through. Now here you can see I've pulled up this idea of tongue because you have to use your tongue to make the L sound, which again adds to the slightly creepy nature of the poem. It's almost sexual in the way that it's presented. But again, it shows this tight control because it takes this single one all the way through. It's like stitching through the poem, just like these full stops do it, so that repetition of that L sound does it. Obviously stitching would link in with this idea of taxidermy, and these very tightly controlled tercets that you have then link to this idea of the control in the situation. They don't change, it's very consistent all the way through. Now, I'm pointing out that Carol Ann Duffy has been described as a ventriloquist because she takes on the characteristics of other personas in her poetry. So please do not think that the speaker of the poem is Duffy, because to my knowledge she has never taxidermied anybody. But think about this idea that she's taking on this character. How is she creating the voice of the character through the words that she has chosen? And that is a very brief summary of what you may have learned about stuffed. Thank you.